Hi everyone, I'm very happy to be at devcom online and I hope that you and your loved ones are healthy and staying safe. We're going to talk about UX and ethics now. My name is Celia Hodent. I have a PhD in psychology and I've been working in the video game industry for over 10 years now. I worked at Ubisoft, I worked at Lucasarts and at Epic Games where I was director of user experience there at the studio level. So I worked on multiple projects like Unreal Engine and I worked very closely with the Fortnite team. I left Epic in October 2017 and ever since then I'm an independent consultant. So a quick definition of user experience is to anticipate and verify how target users perceive a game and how they interact with it, including how engaging the experience is relative to the design intentions. So as developers, and I mean everybody who's working on the game, we have a specific mental model of what we believe the game is all about. And we have all these ideas that we put into a system that has specific constraints, and we have constraints of time and resources. And at the end of the day, our players, they're going to make up their own mental model of what they believe the game is all about only through their interaction with the system image. So everything that is between the engine and what they perceive and do. So it covers pretty much everything that people perceive and interact with. It's not just about the UI. And the idea is to ensure that whatever we wanted to offer them, our intentions, is what players are experiencing in the end. So to do that, we shift from our own perspective to try to adopt the perspective of the players. So this concept of UX is not new. It's been around for quite a while, and Don Norman is the one who's really coined the term of UX in the 90s. But those concepts are all about human-computer interaction, and human factors psychology has been around for way longer than that. So a few elements to accomplish that, to have this user experience mindset, is first of all to understand a little bit about cognitive science. And the reason why it's important to do that is because the experience of a game happens in people's minds. So we need to understand a little bit about cognitive science, and then I'm going to tell you very briefly about the game UX framework that you can use and the methodology that we use. And the last part is going to be about ethics. So here's a very simplified illustration of what's going on in the brain when we learn or when we process things in our environment. So anytime that we learn something, for example, it always starts with perception. It starts with the inputs that that our senses sense from the environment. By the way, we don't only have 5 senses. We have many more than that. And we're going to process that information that comes from our senses, and at the end of the day, if we learn about something new, it will change something in our memory physically. We have new synapses. Synapses are connections between neurons. And so anything we do is changing our brain. So yes, playing a video game is going to rewire your brain because the brain is not pre-wired in the first place. We have brain plasticity and we need that plasticity to adjust to our ever-changing environment. So reading a book, playing a game, watching a movie, even right now listening to what I'm telling you is going to rewire your brain. So it's totally normal. And there are a lot of factors that influence the quality of this information processing. You have some biological factors, some physiological factors. Here I'm only going to talk about attention. We know that the more we pay attention to something, the better we remember and the better we learn. So again, this is really highly simplified. The brain is actually not working as simply as that. And we don't have like independent buckets like this. It's way more complex. But just to simplify here, I'm going to show you one of the main limitations of the brain in terms of perception, memory, and attention. So first of all, look at this image and try to think about what you perceive here. Usually when I do that with a live audience, I get fairly quickly a bunch of people telling me Street Fighter characters. So I typically get about 30% of my audience, even among game developers, that are very enthusiastic about Street Fighter, and they're gonna yell Street Fighter characters. But for other people, they just see colors, maybe people. Sometimes I get DNA or rugs. And if you're colorblind, like about 8% of the male population, you are feeling excluded from this example. And I apologize for that. And it's a good reminder for everyone to never convey information only through colors. So this is just to explain to you that perception is subjective. It is a construct of the mind. There is a reality that we all live in, and we all have a different perception of it. So perception is a subjective construction of the mind. This is a bit problematic because a video game is just a series of input that is processed through our senses, mainly visual and audio, and we need to ensure that our players are going to perceive these elements the way we intended, unless we want to challenge them on perception, but that's a different story. And so that's the reason why we playtest a lot, because we can't be sure that what we're trying to convey is what's going to be perceived. So here's an example from Fortnite. We brought people in to play the game, the prototype that we had back then, and they were experiencing the game and the menus. They were interacting with all of that. And then we asked them to explain what they saw, what they perceived in certain icons. Here's one of the icons that we tested. Maybe you recognized this is the icon to represent traps in the main menu to show all the traps that you have. The problem is that not all players recognize that icon. Some players thought it was related to construction, something to do with trees, or some people saw ammunition in there. So it means that our icon is not clear for everyone, and we need to change it so we can make sure that what's intended with this icon is what is perceived in the end by players. So we changed it into a archetype of a bear trap. There are no bear traps in Fortnite, but as soon as we changed it, players understood that this was related to traps. So this is an example of how we can ensure that what we intend to convey is what players are experiencing. And of course, here I'm just showing you an example with UI, but it's not just the UI, it's everything. It's the environment, it's the character design. So it's just, again, UX is not just about UI. So now let's do another little game. Try to visualize in your mind the thinker, le penseur, from Auguste Rodin, and try to remember on which leg or legs lay which arm or arms of the thinker. So usually when I do it live, I have a bunch of people that try to reproduce with their own body the thinker to try to remember its posture. So let's take a look at the answer. A lot of people think that it has the right arm on the left leg or the right arm on the right leg, or vice versa, but he actually has both arms laying on the left leg. And most people, it's very rare when someone has it correctly, and the reason why is because our memory is fallible. Perception is a construct of the brain, memory is a reconstruction. And when we reconstruct our memories, we're gonna make some mistakes along the way. So it's not as if we were taking pictures or making recordings, and when we have to remember stuff, it comes back to our consciousness. Not the way it works. So we should not rely too much on players' memories because it's very fallible. So that's the reason why we need to reduce the memory load for players, and the HUD is a very good way to give away information to players so they don't have to remember it. Here, for example, you know what weapons you have equipped, but also whenever you come close to a searchable object, the game is telling you what key you need to press. You don't have to remember that information. Another example, if you care to craft a specific item, you don't have to remember the name of that item, you don't have to remember the ingredients or how many you're missing. You can just pin this on your HUD and just go on with your objectives without having to remember information that you don't care about. Now let's do another game. I'm going to show you some cards. It's going to go pretty fast. I'm asking you to choose one card and to try to remember that card as accurately as you can. So pick a card, try to remember it very accurately. All right, now I bet I can guess which card you picked and make it disappear. Ta-da! Okay, I know it's a pretty crappy magic trick, especially online, but I hope it worked for some of you. If it did work for you, what happened here is that I've changed all the cards. In psychology, this is called change blindness. In magic, we call that misdirection. And what's going on here is we have poor attentional resources, and so we're not scanning our environment very precisely. When we're focusing on one element, everything else is like filtered out, and so it's easy to just change a lot of elements without you noticing because you did not really pay attention to everything in your environment. And so our attentional resources also are very scarce, and we also need to take that into account. Now, a lot of games are challenging attention. All action games are challenging players' attention a lot. But what you want to do is to avoid challenging attention when you did not want to do that, or to challenge more than you wanted, or when there's a lot of distracting things that happen in the game at the moment where you're trying to convey something very important for the game. So it's typically during the onboarding phase or tutorials, for example. Here I'm going to show you an example from Fortnite. It's a video from a playtest that happened in 2014. At that moment in the game, we're trying to teach players how to heal. So back then you had to consume a health item to heal. And the way we do that is the first time that the player's health is going below 50%, that triggers the tutorial text for healing. So it looks like this. Player is getting hurt, so it's the first time that their health bar is going below 50%, and this is how you have the gameplay tip. You've been hurt, consume a health item to make yourself feel better, and then it disappears, and players are still battling with zombies. So of course what happened here is most players did not even notice that something was happening in the HUD, because again, attention resources are very scarce. So we can hardly pay attention to tutorial text when we're busy killing zombies. Most of the time we can't multitask efficiently. That's a big myth. So if you want to convey something that is important to players, make sure that there's not too much happening around it. Otherwise players are going to have a hard time focusing on what you want them to focus. So again, this is highly simplified, but overall remember that perception is subjective, attention is scarce, and memory is fallible. That's very important to take into account when you're developing your game, so you can offer the experience that you want to offer. And of course, a video game is gonna challenge players on some elements. You can challenge perception. In a game like Monument Valley, it's all about challenging perception. I'm not saying you should not do it. I'm saying that depending on what experience you want to offer to what players, you need to make sure that you're not challenging players more than you wanted, or on elements that you did not want to challenge them. So having a UX mindset is to understand how the human brain works a little bit, so you can remove all the frustrations, all the barriers that are not by design. So the way we do that, we have frameworks, and we use methodologies to help us with it. So having a UX mindset when developing a video game is about mainly two pillars. The first one is usability, the ability of the game to be used. And it's all about ensuring that all the signs and feedback that are guiding players in the game are clear, that they are clearly showing, informing the functionality to players, just like the example of the traps before, that the signs and feedback are consistent, that we minimize the workload, that the example with the memory load, etc., etc. And of course, offering a lot of different options for players so the game is more accessible. This is about usability. It's about ensuring that the game is clear and intuitive to use. But a game can be usable and boring. So we don't only care about usability, we also care about making a game fun. So that's the whole point of the second pillar, which is engageability, the ability of the game to be engaging. So engageability is mostly about human motivation. Why are we doing the things that we do? It's pretty complex, and we're still trying to understand how this works. But mainly there are two main types of motivation that are useful for us when we make games. It's extrinsic motivation, doing things in order to gain something else. So it's all about having meaningful goals and having rewards after we accomplish these goals. But you also have another type of motivation. It's intrinsic motivation, the things we do for the pleasure of doing them. And we know from one of the main theory out there called SDT, for self-determination theory, that we are more motivated to do activities when this activity is satisfying our need for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. There's a lot to say about this. This is not the topic of this presentation, but you can go on my website and find my previous presentations on this topic. Emotion and game flow are also here to support motivation, and they're really important, especially learning curve and difficulty curve, making sure that the game is never too easy or too hard. At the end of the day, it's making sure that the game is always going to be meaningful to players, that players want to do things because they care about it. Just like right now, players are more likely to care about learning how to build because they need to get out of here, and they're on the way to get out from this cave unless they build stairs. So all in all, this is the game user experience framework that I'm using. And this can guide game developers to ensure that they're not missing or forgetting anything. It's just like a checklist, just like pilots have. Even though pilots are highly trained people, they are still using a checklist to ensure that they're not forgetting anything. And of course, we use playtests. We have a scientific method to test things along the way, so we don't rely on our gut feelings, because we are biased as humans. And we know our game much too well to be able to know what is working and not working and how people are going to perceive it. So we always need to test in a as objective way as possible using the scientific method to guide us. So UX is about considering human factors when we design, when we build an environment, and it's about putting players first. Not necessarily what we care about first, and not the business first. Which leads me to ethics. So ethics is a very important topic, especially in UX. And we have to understand that there's no such thing as neutral design. Anything we interact with, even a door, if there's a handle on one side of the door, this is influencing us to grab the handle and to pull. So if the door needs to be pushed, then we are misled. So of course, it's not a big deal, but we need to understand that anything that we design, any environment, is going to influence our emotions and is going to influence the way we interact with it. And so all the things that I told you about, the human brain flaws, the perception is subjective, attention is scarce, and memory is fallible, can be used against users. We also have many biases that I didn't talk about. This is a representation of all the biases that we have. The idea is not to look into it precisely. The idea is more for you to understand that we have many of them. These biases are influencing our decisions and often is leading us to make bad decisions for us in the long term. And so exploiting these biases can lead to what we call dark patterns. So what is a dark pattern? It's a design that is intentionally deceiving for the benefit of the company at the expense of users. So at its core, it's like the anti-UX. A dark pattern is not putting the humans first, it's putting the business first. So here's an example of a dark pattern from Amazon, who is using quite a bunch of dark patterns. So here it was when you are placing stuff in your cart and then you want to check out, you would see this screen. I'm not sure if it's still current, but you have a screen like this with a big orange button saying get started with a bunch of text that we usually don't read. And we might believe that if we click on get started, it's just gonna go to checking out. Actually, if you press on the big orange button right here, it is subscribing you to Amazon Prime. If you want to check out without subscribing to Amazon Prime, you need to click on that very tiny link here. And on top of that, they are expressing that you're stupid because you are not saving $19. So here it's exploiting, at the very least, our scarce attentional resources, because if we don't pay attention and we're very busy people, we just click, we can actually subscribe to Amazon Prime without really wanting to. And it's also making us feel stupid, which is another layer of a dark pattern. So here's an example on mobile. It pretends that there's a hair on the screen, and so users do a swipe up gesture to get rid of the hair, and as they do that, they actually get into the store. So that's a very interesting one. If you're interested in learning more about dark patterns, I invite you to consult the website darkpatterns.org. Besides dark patterns, there are a lot of gray area practices. So it's not completely dark patterns, but they're pretty shady practices. So I'm going to take the example of loot boxes here because we've been talking a lot about these recently, and they're banned in certain countries, just like in Belgium. So are loot boxes a shady practice? Loot boxes are a form of intermittent rewards with a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. The Skinner box, remember? So the Skinner box, of course, it's all about the rat or the pigeon is going to get a reward if they press on the correct pedal when there's a light turning on, for example. And Skinner has experienced between different types of intermittent rewards. You have rewards that are predictable and that happen based off of time, so at an interval. An example of that in video games are daily rewards. So every day you log in, you're going to get your reward. And so it's fixed. You can predict when it's going to happen, and it's based off of time. You also have other rewards that are based on time. It's going to happen at some point. You are not controlling it, but you cannot predict it. So rare spawns are an example of variable interval rewards. You don't know when that's going to happen. It's going to happen at some point, and you cannot predict it. Now you have rewards that are not based on time and based on how many actions you do. An example of fixed ratio reward is when you do a certain amount of time the same behavior before getting the reward. So typically, achievements are a type of fixed ratio reward. If we tell players, hey, you need to kill 10 zombies to get a reward, that's fixed. You can predict it. You have to do 10 times a certain behavior, and it's based on your behavior. So it's a fixed ratio reward. And lastly, you have variable ratio rewards. So these are loot boxes. This is when you have to do something, you have to do an action, but you only have like a certain chance of getting something. So this is how these types of rewards impact animal behavior. So here you see when the rewards are fixed, whether it is based off time or on behavior, there's always a pause after the reward. So you don't see the behavior anymore once we got the reward that we wanted. When it's variable, it's way more stable over time. So even if we got the reward, we're going to try again because maybe it's going to happen right after. We don't know because it's unpredictable. And when it's unpredictable and based on behavior, so variable ratio, it's both high and steady response rate. Of course, this was done on animals. Humans are a bit more complex, but still, we know that variable ratio rewards are more engaging. So is it a problem to use variable ratio rewards? I don't think so. It's actually used very often, especially in games. So any game that uses a draw of cards or a throw of dice is using variable ratio rewards. RNG is using variable ratio rewards, and so are loot boxes and card packs and stuff like that. It's becoming a bit more shady when we use this practice not to make a game more fun because we're going to have a surprise reward, like in Mario Kart when you have a bonus and you don't know what you're going to get. It is a variable ratio reward. I think it's becoming a little bit more shady when these loot boxes are used to encourage conversion, so monetization. This is when it's a little bit more problematic because we know that we use the power of engagement of these rewards to encourage payment, and it's especially shady with minors. Because minors, children, and teenagers are not as good as adults to control their impulses or automatic behavior. So in our brains, we have what we call the prefrontal cortex. And this area of the brain, among other stuff, is helping us control automatic behavior. So for example, in the morning, if every day you take a certain path to go to work and that day you need to go to the doctors, it's thanks to your prefrontal cortex that you actually don't do the automatic behavior and you can control and do what you have to do that day. So it's also controlling on some impulses, like what you need to do when something looks very engaging, like a loot box, to say, well, stop, I spent enough, now this is over. Or stop watching the TV series that you love because you know that tomorrow you need to wake up and so you need to sleep, etc. The problem is that this area of the brain takes much longer time to mature than other areas. It's completely mature around 23 or 25 years old. And so for children and teenagers, it's going to be even more difficult for them to stop and think and to control such behaviors from happening. So of course, it's not as if children are completely helpless, it's just making it a bit harder for them to control their behavior. And so using these practices that is all about engaging people more to buy more is going to be especially tricky for teenagers and for children to control. That's the reason why gambling and loot boxes tied to monetization should not be allowed with minors. And the problem is that with video games, we can't control what age is the player. And so that's the reason why there's a lot of discussion about banning altogether loot boxes. Here are other gray areas examples, and they're all about exploiting human biases. And again, it's not to offer a better experience. This is about making it better for business at the expense of the users. Scarcity is an example of that. I don't know about you, but where I live in California, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were not a lot of toilet paper left. And so there was scarcity of toilet paper. And so this is when it's actually making you want to buy some toilet paper just in case you're never going to have it. Scarcity goes well with the fear of missing out. So this is when you have an amazing offer and it's ending at a certain period of time, or you have to be there at a certain moment. Otherwise, you're going to miss out on something amazing or miss out on a discount or something like that. Loss aversion. For humans, losing something is actually pretty painful. It's more painful to lose something than to not gain something else. So mechanics that are exploiting this human bias is all about making people come back or re-engage, otherwise they're going to lose something. So the snap streak in Snapchat is a good example of that. You need to come back, otherwise you're going to lose a streak. So it's all about playing around loss aversion. The last example is anchoring effect. As humans, our decisions are biased in the sense that we always compare things to another. And so if we see a previous price that's super high, and then we see today it's you have a lot of discount and here's the new price, we're going to feel that it's a good deal because of the anchoring effect. So we use some of these things in some video games. So what can we do? We need to identify potentially shady practices and reconsider them. And especially with minors, we need to avoid them altogether. So guilt tripping, paying to remove discomfort, loot boxes tied to monetization, fear of missing out, loss aversion, autoplay, etc., etc. These last elements, FOMO, loss aversion, autoplay, it's part of what we call the attention economy. It's all about encouraging people to engage or even to punish them if they disengage. Like fear of missing out, it's effectively punishing you if you're not there at the time that something amazing happens. Loss aversion, let's take the example of rewards, daily rewards that are cumulative. If at some point you don't log in, you're going to lose your streak and you go back to the beginning. Autoplay, Facebook and Netflix and YouTube do that. Certain games do that as well. Once you're done playing your multiplayer game, you're back in the lobby and then you have a countdown so that you're going to be automatically matched into another game. So all of that can encourage players to stay, and we particularly need to be careful when it feels that we're punishing disengagement. And yes, I'm using a dark pattern here because I'm guilt tripping you. I should not do that. I should not have done that. Sorry. Anyway, so sometimes it's not super clear if something is a dark pattern or good UX. This is why a lot of people are confused and sometimes believe that good UX is actually bad UX. So it's not the case. Here is an example from World of Warcraft. It's an old screenshot, but in this example, when you try to delete a character, you have confirmation screen, and not only that, but you have to type in delete before really deleting this character. Some people can say, hey, wait a minute, this looks like a dark pattern because it's actually making it more difficult to disengage with World of Warcraft, and it's to the benefit of Blizzard to not let people deleting a character. But here I would argue that it's actually a good UX practice because this is what we call error prevention. We know that people don't pay attention and sometimes they might do something that is actually to their detriment, and we want to prevent that from happening. So that's a win-win situation. It's also to the benefit of users. It would start to be a dark pattern if the character was crying as we were trying to delete it. That would be using guilt tripping. The brain is very good at making sense of the environment with very little information. This is how we actually survived our predators. But from time to time, because our environment is pretty complex, it's actually making us make bad decisions or draw wrong conclusions. So we have to be mindful of that as developers so we can offer the best experience possible to our players. This is what the UX mindset is all about. And we also have to be careful not to exploit these biases and brain flaws to the detriment of our players. A UX approach is incompatible with the use of dark patterns and shady practices because the UX mindset is all about putting humans first, putting players first in our case. Of course, we need to be mindful of the business. We need to survive, and it's not easy. It's actually pretty difficult to stay afloat in the game industry. I totally get it. So we need to ensure that the games are going to be profitable, but not by using shady practices so that it's to the detriment of users and only to the benefit of the company. I encourage you to take a look at the initiative that we started with a few people, ethicalgames.org, which is all about trying to define where the line is and how we can try to build together a code of ethics in the game industry to improve ethics in video games. Thanks a lot for your attention. On my website, celiahodent.com, you'll find a bunch of resources, including a list of books if you want to dive deeper on some topics, and you can also reach out to me on Twitter. Thanks again, and stay safe.